For the first 200,000 years or so of Homo sapiens' existence, the moment the sun dropped below the horizon, our species turned into something close to easy prey. Human eyes are genuinely terrible in low light compared to the predators that once hunted us. Our night vision is roughly 100 times weaker than a cat's, and unlike almost every serious nocturnal predator on the African savanna, we can't smell or hear our way through darkness particularly well either. And yet, somehow, our ancestors didn't just survive the night, they filled it with something that, according to modern anthropological research, may have fundamentally reshaped human culture, human relationships, and even human cognition itself. What ancient humans actually did after dark turns out to be one of the most quietly important chapters in our entire evolutionary story. And by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why nighttime, not daytime, might be where a huge portion of what makes us human actually got built. Let's start with the obvious problem night created in the first place, because it explains everything that came afterward. For the vast majority of human evolutionary history, darkness meant vulnerability. Lions, leopards, and hyenas, the exact predators competing with early humans across the African landscape, are considerably better equipped for low-light hunting than we ever were, and the archaeological and anthropological record makes clear that nighttime predation was a very real, very present danger for early hominins. This single fact shaped nearly everything about how ancient humans structured their nights. Sleeping in the open wasn't a viable option. Groups needed protection, elevation, or some kind of barrier between themselves and whatever might be moving through the darkness looking for a meal. Which brings us directly to the single invention that changed the entire nighttime equation for our species: fire. This vulnerability didn't just shape ancient behavior, it appears to have left a lasting mark on human psychology itself, one you can probably still feel in your own body under the right conditions. Fear of darkness, or nyctophobia in its more extreme clinical form, is remarkably common and remarkably consistent across human cultures with no shared connection to one another, which is exactly the kind of pattern evolutionary psychologists point to as evidence of a deep, inherited trait rather than a learned cultural quirk. The basic logic is straightforward once you consider it from an ancestral perspective. A human ancestor who felt a surge of anxious alertness at unexplained sounds or movement in the dark, and who therefore stayed close to the fire, close to the group, and away from the tall grass at the edge of camp, was simply more likely to survive the night than one who felt nothing at all. That mild, persistent unease many people still report feeling walking through a dark house or a dim parking lot today isn't necessarily an irrational glitch. It's very plausibly an inherited alarm system, tuned over hundreds of thousands of years to a level of nighttime danger that, for the overwhelming majority of human history, was entirely real. Archaeological evidence indicates that human ancestors had at least sporadic control of fire more than 1 million years ago, with regular, consistent use becoming firmly established by around 400,000 years ago. Fire did far more than simply provide warmth or cook food, though both of those functions mattered enormously. It fundamentally altered the boundaries of the human day. For the first time in the story of our species, humans could reliably push back the darkness itself, creating a small, defensible circle of visibility and safety that persisted long after the sun went down. According to researchers studying this transition, fire effectively extended the useful human day by several hours, hours that early humans suddenly had to fill with something, since predators, cold, and poor visibility made most productive daytime activities, hunting, foraging, tool-making in fine detail, impossible or unwise once darkness fell. So what did they actually do with those extra hours? This is where one of the most fascinating pieces of modern anthropological research comes in. In 2014, anthropologist Polly Wiesner, who spent roughly 40 years studying the Jew Hoansi, or Kung, Bushmen of the Kalahari Desert, a hunter-gatherer people whose way of life closely resembles that of our ancestors for the overwhelming majority of human evolutionary history, published a genuinely groundbreaking study comparing what these communities actually talked about during the day versus after dark. The difference she found wasn't subtle. It was almost a complete reversal in the entire purpose of human conversation. Daytime talk, Wiesner found, centered overwhelmingly on practical matters, coordinating food gathering, resolving minor disputes, and what researchers call sanctioning gossip, the kind of social monitoring that keeps a small community's behavior in check. But the moment the fire was lit and darkness settled in, conversation transformed almost entirely. Firelit talk shifted dramatically towards storytelling, myth, humor, and the kind of imaginative, emotionally rich conversation that builds deep social bonds and extended trust between individuals, even those from distant, unfamiliar camps. Wiesner described something almost magical happening in that specific transition from day to night. There's something about fire in the middle of darkness, she noted, that bonds, mellows, and genuinely excites people in a way ordinary daytime interaction simply doesn't produce. Nighttime around a fire, in her assessment, functions as something close to a universal human institution, a dedicated, protected space specifically for bonding, entertaining, and sharing the kind of stories and cultural knowledge that daytime's practical urgency rarely leaves room for. Her research suggests this pattern goes back an extraordinarily long way, potentially tied directly to when fire first became a reliable, everyday tool rather than an occasional lucky find, meaning nighttime storytelling might be old enough to have shaped the actual cognitive and social evolution of our species, not just entertained it after the fact. This detail matters more than it might initially seem, because storytelling of this kind does something practically and evolutionarily valuable that simple daytime gossip doesn't. According to researchers studying Wiesner's findings, nighttime firelit conversation plays a critical role in what psychologists call theory of mind, the ability to imagine and understand the internal thoughts, motivations, and perspectives of other people, including people you've never actually met. Stories, myths, and shared narratives passed between camps allowed information, alliances, and cultural values to spread across vast, otherwise disconnected hunter-gatherer networks, effectively functioning, in Wiesner's own words, as something close to the original social media, an information and trust-building system running purely on firelight and spoken language, long before anything resembling writing existed anywhere on the planet. If any of this is changing how you think about sitting quietly with people after dark, that's exactly the kind of hidden thread I love pulling on in this channel. And if you want to keep following threads like it, subscribing means the next one finds you automatically. Because storytelling and bonding weren't the only things happening once the fire was lit, and the next part of ancient nighttime life gets considerably stranger. Sleep itself turns out to be far more complicated and far more contested than most people assume, and it's worth walking through the actual disagreement in the research rather than presenting one tidy answer. Historian Roger Eckhurch spent years examining pre-industrial European court records, diaries, and literature, and concluded that before artificial lighting became widespread, humans in early modern Europe typically slept in two distinct segments each night: a first sleep shortly after dark, followed by an hour or more of quiet, deliberate wakefulness in the middle of the night, often used for prayer, conversation, or simply lying awake in the dark, before drifting into a second sleep that lasted until dawn. Eckhurch found references to this exact pattern scattered throughout centuries of historical documents, from Homer and Virgil all the way through medieval and early modern European sources, and argued this segmented pattern represented humanity's natural, default sleep architecture before industrial lighting and rigid work schedules compressed sleep into the single continuous block most of us now consider completely normal. Here's where the research gets genuinely complicated, though, because more recent studies of actual living hunter-gatherer societies tell a noticeably different story. When UCLA sleep researcher Jerome Siegel and his team directly monitored sleep patterns among the Hadza, San, and Tsimane, three present-day societies living without electricity or artificial lighting of any kind, they found no consistent evidence of the segmented, two-phase sleep pattern Eckhurch documented in historical European records. These groups typically slept in one continuous block, averaging around 6.4 hours, staying awake for roughly 3 hours after sunset before finally settling in for the night, rather than deliberately splitting their sleep into two separate intervals. This genuine disagreement between historical written records and direct observation of contemporary hunter-gatherers remains an open, actively debated question in sleep research, and it's a useful reminder that what ancient humans did isn't always a single, settled answer, even when serious researchers are looking directly at the same basic question from different angles. Beyond fire, storytelling, and the ongoing sleep debate, ancient humans also appear to have used the night sky itself as something closer to a functional tool than a passive backdrop. Long before written calendars existed, tracking the moon's roughly 29-day cycle offered ancient communities a genuinely useful way to measure time across weeks and months, useful for coordinating seasonal migrations, tracking pregnancy, or timing recurring ritual gatherings between otherwise scattered groups. Some archaeologists have even proposed that certain marks found alongside prehistoric cave art in sites like Lascaux may represent an early lunar or seasonal notation system, though this specific interpretation remains genuinely debated among researchers rather than settled fact. What's considerably less debated is that, without artificial light pollution of any kind, the night sky available to ancient humans would have been staggeringly, almost incomprehensibly more vivid than what the vast majority of modern humans will ever see. Thousands of individually visible stars, the dense band of the Milky Way clearly visible overhead, a genuinely enormous, ever-present nightly spectacle that most people alive today have literally never witnessed even once. There's genuinely striking visual evidence suggesting some of humanity's most famous art was specifically designed to be experienced this way, in flickering firelight, at night, rather than in the flat, even lighting museums used today. Researchers studying Paleolithic cave paintings, including sites like Chauvet and Spain's Achura cave, have noticed something odd about certain animal figures. Many are drawn with multiple overlapping legs, heads, or bodies, extra limbs that make little sense as a single static image. Paleolithic researcher Mark Azema proposed a genuinely startling explanation. Under steady, even lighting, these images just look confused or poorly drawn. But under the unsteady, moving light of a torch or a grease lamp, exactly the kind of lighting Ice Age artists actually would have carried into these deep caves. Those extra limbs create a crude but genuine illusion of movement, an animal that appears to gallop, swish its tail, or shift position as the flickering light passes across the wall. Archaeologist April Noel and her colleagues have since built modern lamps specifically engineered to replicate the exact color, intensity, and flicker pattern of Paleolithic firelight, and testing them inside painted caves in Australia and Spain, researchers have described the effect as genuinely difficult to put into words, describing it as something close to prehistoric proto-cinema. If this interpretation holds up, it means some of the very first narrative art our species ever created wasn't meant to be viewed in daylight at all. It was built quite deliberately for the dark. Night also carried real practical labor for ancient humans, not just rest and reflection. In many documented hunter-gatherer and early agricultural societies, someone typically needed to remain at least partially alert through the night, tending the fire to keep it from dying out, since a fire that failed could mean waking up to genuine danger, or listening for the specific sounds of an approaching predator near the edge of camp. Night fishing, using torches or fire to attract fish toward the surface, has been independently documented across numerous unconnected cultures throughout history, taking direct advantage of exactly the vulnerability darkness created for other species, even while it remained dangerous for humans themselves. In agricultural societies that developed later, certain time-sensitive tasks, guiding animals during cooler nighttime temperatures, or protecting crops and livestock from nocturnal predators, meant the night was never purely empty, idle time for every member of a community, even in societies with electric light-free nights and comparatively relaxed daytime schedules. Groups also appear to have organized themselves specifically around managing this nighttime vulnerability collectively, rather than leaving each individual to face it alone. In many documented hunter-gatherer and small-scale traditional societies, some form of rotating night vigilance, keeping the fire fed, staying alert for approaching predators or hostile outsiders, fell to different members of the group at different points in the night, functioning as an early, informal version of what later, more organized societies would eventually turn into a genuine sentry watch. This wasn't purely defensive labor divorced from everything else discussed in this video. Someone tending the fire at 2 in the morning while everyone else slept was often the same person who'd absorb the tail end of the previous night's storytelling, or who'd catch the first hints of pre-dawn birdsong signaling it was almost time to start the next day's foraging. Night, in other words, wasn't a single uniform experience shared identically by everyone in a camp. It was a shared responsibility, quietly rotating from person to person, that kept the entire group safe enough to actually enjoy everything else darkness had to offer. Put all of this together, and ancient nighttime starts to look considerably more complex and considerably more foundational to human culture than the simple image of people passing out from exhaustion the moment the sun went down. Night was when vulnerability to predators was at its highest, which is precisely why fire became one of the most important technologies our species ever developed. Night was when practical daytime gossip gave way to imaginative storytelling and myth, the specific kind of conversation researchers now believe helped build the deep social trust and shared cultural knowledge that let hunter-gatherer bands cooperate across huge, otherwise disconnected territories. Night was, and in some specific historical contexts may still have been, structured by sleep patterns considerably more complicated than the single continuous block most modern humans now aim for. And night was, in its own quiet way, humanity's first planetarium, its first real calendar, and often its first genuine watch shift, all happening simultaneously around the exact same small, flickering fire. It's worth sitting for a moment with just how recently this entire ancient relationship with night actually broke down. For the overwhelming majority of human existence, night meant firelight, not electric light. A warm, dim, flickering, red-shifted glow that visual psychologists note interacts with the human nervous system in a fundamentally different way than the bright, blue-shifted light pouring out of a modern phone or television screen. That difference isn't trivial. Blue-heavy artificial light specifically suppresses melatonin production far more aggressively than firelight ever did, which may help explain why so many modern humans report lying awake, wired and alert, at exactly the hour our ancestors would have been deep in genuine firelit conversation or already resting. In a strange way, scrolling a phone in bed and sitting up late by a campfire are technically the same ancient behavior, staying meaningfully awake past sunset, doing something social or engaging in low light. But one of those activities spent hundreds of thousands of years being refined by evolution into something that built trust, community, and shared meaning. The other has existed for barely 2 decades, which brings us back to that basic, uncomfortable vulnerability every single ancient human faced the moment daylight disappeared. Poor night vision, weak senses in the dark, and predators specifically built to exploit exactly that weakness. Rather than simply enduring that vulnerability or hiding from it until sunrise, our ancestors built an entire second life around it, one built on fire, story, myth, and the stars, a nightly ritual so foundational that some researchers now argue it may have shaped human social cognition itself, not as some later cultural add-on, but baked directly into the deepest, oldest parts of how humans learn to trust, bond with, and understand each other in the first place. If this is the kind of hidden history connecting ancient humans directly to your own evenings, subscribing means the next one finds you automatically, because it turns out we've never actually stopped needing the fire, the story, or the dark to make sense of each other.